10 minutes after my boss poured wine on me in front of everyone, the $2 billion investor stopped smiling. The room had laughed. I did not react. I made one call. By the time I stepped out of the ballroom, he was walking beside me instead of standing next to her. I remember how quiet the hallway felt compared to the noise we had just left behind. My phone was still in my hand. I was not shaking, which surprised me that I thought I would be. The investor's assistant was already on another call, speaking in a low, controlled voice about a temporary review of the first funding tranche. No one was shouting. That is what people misunderstand about moments like this. They think power shifts loudly. 2 hours earlier, everything had been steady. My name is Delaney Mercer. I am 39 years old, and at the time I was the Chief Strategy Officer of Hargrove Biotech in Chicago. I had spent the last 18 months structuring a $2 billion growth investment with a private equity firm based in New York. The agreement was not just about capital. It was built around governance safeguards that I insisted on during negotiations. I believed in protecting the company from instability, even if it made leadership uncomfortable. I did not think I would need those protections for myself. The gala at the Langham was meant to celebrate the signing. I had reviewed the final compliance language that afternoon in my office overlooking the river, double-checking the executive conduct clause one more time. I told myself it was routine diligence. In hindsight, I may have already sensed something fragile in the way our chief executive, Callista Hargrove, had been acting in the weeks leading up to the event. Callista liked public moments. She liked being seen as the architect of the deal. I understood that dynamic and accepted it. Titles mattered differently to different people. I cared more about structure than spotlight when the live stream cameras were positioned near the stage. I noticed one of them still recording as guests moved around. I considered mentioning it to the events team, but I let it go. It did not seem important at the time. The first glass of wine was poured about 15 minutes into the reception. The second one did not land in a glass. It landed on me, and that is where everything truly began. The wine was still drying on my jacket when I thought back to the first meeting I had with Thomas Avery, the lead partner from the investment firm. That meeting had taken place 9 months earlier in a glass conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. He had already declined us once. We like the science, he told me then, reviewing his notes without looking up. We don't like the volatility at the top. He meant Callista, though he never used her name. At that time, she had dismissed his hesitation as arrogance from New York. I understood it differently. Investors do not fear ambition. They fear unpredictability. After that rejection, I restructured the entire proposal. I redesigned the compliance framework so executive conduct was not treated as a personal matter, but as a financial risk variable. I drafted what became the executive conduct and reputational risk clause myself. It allowed the investor to pause funding if documented leadership behavior created material governance exposure. It was narrow, precise, and tied to objective review standards. I thought of it as insulation. When Thomas and I reviewed the final draft months later, he paused at that section. If leadership destabilizes this company, he said quietly, I need to know who steadies it. I met his eyes across the table. Structure steadies it. He held my gaze a moment longer than necessary. And if the structure fails, then you reassess before capital compounds the damage. That was the first time he nodded without reservation. Publicly. Callista took credit for restoring negotiations. She described the revised deal as proof of her resilience. I did not challenge that narrative when I had no interest in public credit. I cared about enforceable language. Looking back, I understand something I did not fully admit then. I built those protections because I'd already seen small fractures in how she handled pressure. Sharp comments in meetings, impulsive decisions justified as confidence. I documented what I could. I assumed we would never need the clause in a social setting. Tonight proved otherwise. Callista had been moving through the room with practiced ease, greeting board members and donors as if the evening existed entirely for her. Up close, I could see the flush in her cheeks and the extra brightness in her eyes. She handled attention well, but she did not handle sharing it. When Thomas approached us near the stage, she slipped her arm through his as though the investment were already secured beyond question. This partnership proves bold leadership wins, she declared, lifting her glass slightly, not cautious hesitation. Thomas gave a measured smile. Bold leadership still answers to structure. She laughed lightly, though there was an edge to it. Structure follows vision. I felt the shift before anyone else did. I had seen that tone in internal meetings when she felt challenged. One of the event coordinators gestured toward a camera. Callista glanced briefly, then away. We're off broadcast. Right, she asked without waiting for confirmation. The coordinator hesitated. I believe so. She turned back to me, eyes narrowing just enough to register. You've been quiet tonight, Delaney. I've said what needed to be said, I replied evenly. Have you? She swirled the wine in her glass. Sometimes people confuse drafting paperwork with leading. Thomas watched the exchange without intervening. Callista stepped closer. Know your place. The wine tipped forward before I registered the motion. It spread across my shoulder and down the front of my jacket. A few gasps broke out, followed quickly by nervous laughter. Someone near the back actually clapped, thinking it was some kind of joke. Thomas did not move. I did not reach for a napkin right away. I met her eyes instead. There was a split second where she expected anger. I gave her none. Oh, she added, feigning surprise. I didn't realize how close you were. The room continued laughing, but the investor was no longer smiling. I stepped away from the crowd and out onto the balcony, closing the door behind me. The noise softened immediately. I could still hear laughter inside. Thinner now, less certain. I took a slow breath and looked down at the dark water below. It felt steady. I needed that. My phone was already in my hand, and I had not planned to use it tonight. If I filed a formal governance breach report, the first funding tranche could be suspended. That would trigger market speculation before the deal was even operational. The board would call an emergency meeting, but Callista would know it came from me. If I stayed silent, I would be protecting someone who had already ignored documented conduct warnings. I had archived those emails for a reason. I had kept the HR memo from 3 months ago recommending executive coaching after a separate incident with a department head. I told myself at the time that documentation was insurance. I did not expect to collect on it. My thumb hovered over the contact for Thomas's legal liaison. $2 billion, and that number had weight. It meant expanded research, hiring, stability for hundreds of employees. It also meant leverage concentrated in the wrong hands if leadership volatility continued. My hand trembled once before it steadied. I felt embarrassed by that small shake, though no one could see it. I am not immune to pressure. I just don't let it make decisions for me. I typed a short message requesting an immediate compliance review call and attached the archived documentation along with a live stream timestamp. I kept the language clinical. No accusations, no emotion. When the reply came through, it was brief, understood, initiating review. I knew then that whatever happened next would not be reversible. The call connected within 3 minutes. On the screen were Thomas and his firm's general counsel, Rebecca Lynn, whom I had worked with throughout negotiations. Her expression was neutral, which I appreciated. Delaney, Rebecca began, we received your submission. Before we proceed, confirm this is a formal governance notification. It is, I answered. I am invoking the Executive Conduct and Reputational Risk Clause under Section 14. Subsection 3. Thomas leaned back slightly. Walk us through your reasoning. The incident was public, documented, and streamed internally. I explained, it reflects a pattern. I have attached 2 prior written warnings and the HR memorandum recommending executive conduct intervention from March. Rebecca scrolled through the files. You're aware this triggers an automatic review of the first funding tranche. I am. Thomas studied me. If we suspend, the market will interpret that as instability. The instability is already visible. I replied. This review contains it. Ignoring it compounds it. Silence held for a few seconds. I could hear muted music from inside through the balcony door behind me. Rebecca spoke first. Under the clause, we are obligated to initiate independent governance review. Funding tranche 1 will enter temporary suspension pending findings. This is procedural, Thomas added, more quietly. You understand the personal implications. Yes, he did not press further. All right, We'll notify our internal committee immediately. When the call ended, I felt a shift that was not dramatic, but decisive. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing had exploded. A mechanism I helped build had simply activated. I returned inside. The laughter had faded into scattered conversations. Callista was at the bar, retelling the incident as if it were harmless theater. She caught my eye briefly and smiled in a way that suggested control. Within minutes, Thomas's assistant approached her and requested a private word. I stayed where I was. I did not need to follow. The report was no longer mine alone. Thomas and Rebecca returned to the main floor together. They did not look hurried. That alone shifted the mood around them. Conversations thinned as people sensed something formal was about to happen. Callista greeted them with a bright expression. Everything settled. Thomas did not smile this time. We are invoking the Executive Conduct Clause pending independent governance review. The air changed. A few guests stopped mid-sentence. Callista gave a short laugh. Surely this is unnecessary. It was a harmless moment, Rebecca answered evenly. The clause does not assess intent. It assesses exposure. There's no exposure, Callista insisted. This deal is $2 billion. You wouldn't jeopardize that over a social misunderstanding. Thomas held her gaze. We are not jeopardizing it. We are protecting it. She glanced at me for the first time since the spill. The smile disappeared. Did you escalate this? I kept my voice steady. I submitted documentation. You blindsided your own leadership. I followed the framework we agreed to. That landed harder than I expected. Thomas shifted slightly toward me. Delaney, walk with me. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically. He simply turned toward the exit. For a brief moment, I hesitated. Not because I doubted the decision, but because I understood what it would look like. Then I stepped forward. As we moved through the ballroom, phones were already lifting discreetly. Callista remained near the stage, speaking quickly to a board member, trying to contain something that was no longer hers to manage. Outside the main doors, Thomas spoke quietly. This is a review, not a withdrawal. I understand. You may face consequences internally. I understand that too. We continued down the hallway together. The funding had not disappeared. It had shifted position. By 8 o'clock a.m., we were forced to file a Form 8K disclosing the provisional suspension of the anchor funding tranche. The market didn't react to the wine. It reacted to the filing. Our stock opened down 10% as algorithms triggered sell-offs on the news of a funding contingency and governance review uncertainty. No one mentioned wine. Markets rarely care about the gesture. They care about what it signals. An emergency board meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. I received the calendar invitation at 8:12 a.m., marked mandatory. At 9:30, Callista called my direct line. What exactly did you think would happen? She demanded without greeting. I expected the clause to activate a review. I answered. You embarrassed this company. The review protects it. She exhaled sharply. You've frozen $2 billion in funding. Temporarily, I corrected. Pending independent assessment. You could have handled this internally. We did handle it internally. 3 times. There was a pause. You're overstepping. I'm operating within the agreement you approved. Her tone shifted from anger to something colder. The board won't tolerate this kind of instability. The board approved the clause. That doesn't mean they'll side with you. I considered that carefully. This isn't about sides. It feels personal. It isn't. Silence again. Longer this time. Fix this, she repeated. This is the fix. I replied quietly. She ended the call without another word. By 10:15, I received 2 messages from board members requesting background documentation. One of them, Daniel Cho, wrote, "We need clarity before conclusions." That was as close to support as anyone was willing to offer publicly. I understood the risk. Triggering a review could be reframed as destabilizing leadership. If the board chose optics over structure, I could be the easiest variable to remove. But the mechanism was already in motion. All I could do now was stand behind it. The independent review moved faster than most internal processes ever did. Within 4 days, the external governance firm had requested archived correspondence, HR documentation, and prior board minutes. Nothing in their tone suggested outrage. It was methodical. At the emergency session, Rebecca from the investors firm joined remotely. Thomas remained silent for most of it. The review chair began plainly. We have identified 3 prior executive conduct complaints within the past 18 months. Callista shifted in her seat. All resolved, documented. Yes, the chair responded. Corrected. No. A summary appeared on the screen, an incident with a senior researcher during a grant negotiation. A reprimand issued privately but not recorded formally. A recommendation for executive coaching that was declined. Daniel Cho, who had messaged me earlier in the week, spoke up. I flagged reputational exposure last quarter. Callista turned toward him. You mentioned optics, not risk. Optics become risk when capital is involved. Daniel replied evenly. Rebecca leaned forward slightly on screen. The wine incident was not assessed in isolation. It confirmed a pattern of volatility under public pressure. Callista's voice tightened. You're characterizing leadership. We're evaluating governance, Rebecca corrected. There's a difference. Another director, Margaret Ellis, folded her hands. Limiting executive authority at this stage signals weakness to the market. Thomas finally spoke. Volatility signals weakness. The room fell quiet. Rebecca continued. Our condition for reinstating the first funding tranche remains unchanged. Independent oversight must be installed. Executive operational authority must be limited pending performance review. Governance restructuring must be formalized. Callista looked at me directly for the first time during the meeting. This is what you wanted. No. I answered calmly. This is what the clause required. I felt the weight of the shift then. The discussion was no longer about humiliation at a gala. It was about fiduciary responsibility attached to $2 billion in capital. The wine had started the conversation. The documentation was finishing it. The final board meeting took place 3 weeks after the gala. By then, the independent review had been circulated in full. No one raised their voice. The tension was controlled, almost clinical. Callista opened in the discussion. This company cannot function with divided authority. Investors need decisive leadership. Thomas responded without hesitation. Investors need reliable leadership. Margaret Ellis leaned forward. If we limit executive authority now, we risk signaling internal fracture. Daniel Cho countered. We already signaled fracture. The question is whether we correct it. I did not speak until invited. I had prepared a 12-slide stabilization framework outlining phased governance insulation, operational checks, and a 90-day review mechanism tied to tranche reinstatement milestones. Delaney, the chair prompted, walk us through your plan. I'm not requesting a role. I began. I'm outlining a structure that allows capital to deploy without exposure to further volatility. Callista's jaw tightened. This is an opportunistic power grab. It isn't. I answered calmly. If the board assigns someone else to execute it, the framework remains viable. Thomas looked at the directors. Funding resumes only if structural reform is adopted. Without reform, we withdraw the $2 billion in full. Silence followed. The numbers were not abstract. They represented research continuity, hiring plans, and contractual obligations already in motion. Margaret spoke again. If we accept these conditions, what happens to executive authority? Rebecca's voice came through the speakerphone. Operational authority transitions to an independent governance oversight committee pending performance review. The chair summarized the motion. The board moved Callista to the role of executive chair with non-operational duties, effectively stripping her of day-to-day control while preserving the founder image for the press. The governance oversight committee took the helm of the $2 billion deployment. The vote passed by a narrow margin. No one applauded. No one celebrated. Documents were circulated. Signatures followed. Callista remained seated longer than the others. As I gathered my notes, she looked at me steadily. You think this is leadership, she said quietly. I think it's accountability. I replied. By the end of the week, the investor reinstated the first funding tranche. Nothing outwardly dramatic changed, but authority had shifted in a way that did not require spectacle to be real. 6 months after the gala, the full $2 billion investment was deployed. The governance committee met weekly, Reporting lines were clearer, decisions took longer, but they held. Our stock had recovered and moved above its pre-incident level. Analysts now used phrases like improved oversight instead of instability. Callista remained chief executive officer in title, but her role had shifted to advisory functions during the review period. We crossed paths in a hallway one afternoon after a strategy session. "You look comfortable in that chair," she remarked, referring to the oversight seat I now occupied. "It's not about comfort," I replied. "It's about continuity." She studied me for a moment. "You could have handled that night differently." "I did handle it," I answered. "Just not the way you expected." She gave a brief nod and walked on. It wasn't reconciliation, but it wasn't open hostility either. Power rarely ends with clean lines. Later that week, Thomas visited the office to finalize long-term capital deployment milestones. After the meeting, he asked to speak privately. "You didn't react." "He told me that you protected the structure. I protected the agreement." I corrected gently. "That's leadership." He responded. "I thought about that long after he left. I never set out to replace anyone. I set out to make sure that $2 billion didn't magnify a flaw we already knew existed. The lesson, if there is one, is simple. And not dramatic structure matters more than ego. Documentation matters. Calm decisions under pressure matter. Respect, once compromised publicly, becomes a financial variable whether we acknowledge it or not. That night at home, I replayed the moment in my mind one last time. She poured wine to remind me of my place. I reminded her who built the foundation. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, comment, or subscribe. Conversations about leadership and accountability deserve more light than spectacle. I don't consider what happened a victory, that it was a correction. And sometimes correction is enough.